Hello, in the previous video, I showed you how to create and set up the IRM HR data connector to monitor risky users, such as those who submitted a resignation or had a bad performance review. It is very easy to set it up and use it, but it still requires technical skills. For instance, generating the ISO 8601 date format using PowerShell and executing the PowerShell script that uploads the CSV file to M365. Additionally, executing the script means that the parameters such as tenant ID, application ID, secret, and object ID for the connector must be used every time the script is run, which could impose potential security risks. Even creating entries in the CSV file could be confusing and prone to errors. I'm going to demonstrate a solution to solve these problems. I created a Canvas app for entering the values, and this is a more user-friendly solution. The Canvas app then uses a Power Automate flow to save the CSV file in the SharePoint library. Creation of this file in the SharePoint library triggers yet another Power Automate flow, which then uploads the CSV file to the M365 IRM. Why do we even consider HR workers entering data themselves? Ideally, HR system should be integrated with the HR data connector to automatically update connector data whenever an employee submits a resignation or receives a bad performance review. Why do we even need to bother with entering this data somewhere else? While it is definitely the ideal solution to integrate the HR system with IRM, the reality is that the integration might not be feasible. It is not a rocket science to use web services, or if your HR system is built on the D365 ERP. But in many cases, you will be met with the following showstoppers. HR systems run on legacy platforms. For this type of the integration, you would normally need to have a blessing from the architecture board and the corporate security, which could become an adventure. The owners of the HR systems are usually very protective, and that is for the good reasons. Depending on how your HR system is designed, it might or might not be easy to differentiate between the events that you need for the IRM data connector without modifications done to the HR system. Integration testing could be quite an exercise. Integrating the HR data connector with HR system would be a solution that involves many teams and will take a while to implement. It is easy and faster to create a very simple Canvas app and a couple of simple Power Automate flows. Sure, the HR officers would be required to use the Canvas app to enter the information yet again, but there are literally 4 mandatory fields at the most. And how often do people submit resignations in any given day or are demoted? Even if it's a large organization that would be able to commit to integrating the HR system with IRM, this Canvas app could be used as the interim solution for your insider risk management implementation. Okay, let's dive into the solution. But if you're not familiar with the HR data connector, I suggest that you watch a video on setting up the HR data connector first. The link is in the description. And so here is the Canvas app. It is very simple, nothing fancy, it's functional. If you want to elevate it by using cooler controls, you are more than welcome, but this works for me. The app has 2 screens. One is for entering the data, and the second screen is for showing a grid with all of the entries that the user submitted during this session. Depending on the selection of the scenario, that is the HR scenario such as resignation or performance review, date pickers will be disabled or enabled, and the text boxes will also be enabled or disabled depending on the scenario. For instance, the resignation date and last working day are applicable to the resignation event, but not for the performance review. We select a user from the combo box. We can also type a username or email address, and we are getting the UPN saved in a grid. These are the temporary entries that are created as a result of this user session, and they will be later saved in the file. Let's create another entry. We are going to choose the job level change, and the old level and the new level controls are now enabled. So we're going to enter the old level position and the new level, which is a demoted level. And now we're entering the effective date, and it is saved to the grid here. Note the mandatory fields. They are marked with the red asterisk. Username or the user principal name is one of those. When the user tries to save the entry without the valid UPN name, the application is going to give an error message. And now we can save the entries to the CSV file. Let's do that. So the file is created behind the scene, and the user is giving the file name, which is auto-generated based on a timestamp. And if you refresh the library, here it is. Note that when the file is created and saved, we clear the grid, so there are no entries from the last session since we already saved them all. And here is our CSV. Note that the dates are in the ISO 8601 date format. And now I'm going to show you how to implement this solution. This solution uses 3 SharePoint objects, 1 SharePoint library and 2 SharePoint lists. The SharePoint library IRM HR data connector files is the repository for the CSV files created with the help of the Canvas app and Power Automate Flow. Now let's take a look at the 2 SharePoint lists. The first one is HR data connector scenarios SharePoint list. This list contains all HR scenarios that you will be using in your IRM HR data connector. It will be used to populate the drop-down list with the scenarios in the Canvas app. HR connector data table SharePoint list. This list represents the empty structure of the table for the connector data. It is here for convenience. I'm using a table control in a Canvas app, and it was just too tempting to create something straightforward to bind it to the table control. Needless to say, HR data is highly sensitive, and we must protect it well. So we're going to create a security group in Microsoft Entra. This group will be for the people who can run the Canvas app, access the SharePoint library where CSV files are uploaded, and access 2 SharePoint lists. Go to Microsoft Entra Admin Center. Click the Identity blade to expand it and select Groups. Select New Group. Enter the group name. Keep the Assign membership type. Add group owners. Add group members. And after the group is created, note the group object ID. You will be using this ID in the Canvas app. Next, we are going to make sure that only authorized HR officers can access this library. Remember, the CSV files will contain very sensitive information. We are going to restrict library access to the member of the group we just created. Go to the library settings, select Permissions for this document library. Click on Stop Inheriting Permissions. This is required to create specific permissions for this library. You might want to refresh the page to see the settings applied. Then select Grant Permissions. Select Invite People in the pop-up dialog box. Add the group that you just created in the previous step. In my case, it's IRM HR Data Connector Managers. Once the group is selected, click Share. Remove the members and the visitor groups, but keep the owners group. Do the same for the HR Data Connector Scenarios SharePoint list and for the HR Connector Data Table SharePoint list. One more thing. For the IRM HR Data Connector files SharePoint library, that is a library where we're going to be saving our HR CSV files, I'd like to make sure that this file will never show up in the search result. Go to the library settings, choose Advanced Settings, scroll down to the search section, and set Allow items for this document library to appear in search results to No. Click OK to save. This is not security through obscurity method, and there are security trimmings in SharePoint, but I still want to have this setting. Let's now move to the Canvas app, the centerpiece of this solution. I'm going to show you some critical pieces of functionality and the code. However, keep in mind that this is not a tutorial on Power Apps. I will not be going over trivial things such as how to set up a default property of a control or how to change the display mode of a control. This tutorial is for the IRM HR data connector, and I'll be concentrating on the Canvas app code related to that. First, we are going to create connections to the SharePoint library and 2 SharePoint lists that we previously created. If you don't know how to create a connection to the SharePoint, you need to select Data tab on the left side and then click Add Data. You will need to select a data source and then scroll down to the connectors. Once you expand the connectors section, you can scroll down to the SharePoint, or you can enter SharePoint in the search and you can easily see the connection. Click on the SharePoint connection. Select Connect Directly Cloud Services option and click Connect. In the next screen, enter the URL for the location of your lists and library. Once you connect to the site, you will see the list and the library that you previously created. Here is the HR connector data table list, HR data connector scenarios list, and the IRM HR data connector files library. Click connect and these connections will be added to your data sources. Then we're going to add the Office 365 users connection, and this connection will help us to grab all of the M365 users to populate the users combo box. Another connection, Office 365 groups, and this connection will help us ensure that only the users who are members of the IRM HR data connector group can run this application, and this is the group that we previously created. In the app on start event, we are going to create a collection to hold the HR scenarios that we stored in the SharePoint list. We will use this collection for the drop-down list scenarios. Set the items property of the drop-down list to the collection scenarios. In the second screen of the application, we're going to be using the data table for the entries that the user collects during the session. Use the items property to connect to that SharePoint list. This is a temporary holder for the entries during the user session. As soon as the user saves the information to the CSV file, all of these entries are going to be cleared from the data table and from the underlying SharePoint list. For the combo emails, we are going to filter the active M365 profiles using the Office 365 users connector and the search user v2 method. Note that the combo box will display the user name as well as the user principal name. Next, we want to make sure that only authorized users are allowed to execute this application. We are going to create a group members collection, and we are going to populate that collection with the members of the group that we previously created. We then check if the user who is running the application is a member of that group, and if the user is not a member, we simply exit the application. We need to be able to reset the display mode of the controls depending on the HR scenario that the user selects from the drop-down list. And here is one of the examples. I'm using the remarks text control. And here's the code that adds a newly created record to the table. It is executed within the onSelect event of the button add. First, we check that the user was selected. Remember, the UPN is the mandatory entry for the HR data connector. We use the patch function. As soon as the record is added to the HR connector data table, we can see them in the table control on the next screen. The data source of the table control is set to the HR connector data table. We can also edit an existing record. We can use the onSelect event of the table control to set the temp selected item to the selected item. If the user wants to delete the item, we're going to use the remove function in the onSelect event of the delete button. I'm sure that you'll be able to create the Canvas app and take care of other controls and events without any issues. It's a no-brainer. It's a very simple functionality. But now I'm going to concentrate on the main functionality, saving the records to the CSV files. I do it in two stages. First, I create the content of the comma-delimited CSV file in the Canvas app, and then I run the para-automate flow that will create this file in the SharePoint library we created earlier. There are a couple of ways to accomplish this. You can just send the content of the table to the flow as is and create an action in the flow that will create a comma-delimited CSV file. In this example, I create a comma-delimited string right here in the Canvas app, and the flow just saves it in the SharePoint. Either way would work. It is up to you. And here is the code for the onSelect event of the Save button. This code creates comma-delimited entries. Note that the IRM HR data connector expects dates in the ISO 8601 format, and this is what this code is doing. It converts the dates such as resignation date to that specific format. And here is we're setting the CSV content string to the collection values. And then we pass this CSV content string to the para-automate flow. We set the file URL, which is the name of the file that's been generated by the flow. We use file URL to notify the user of the newly generated file name. When we run the app and click Save, you see that this is the file name that is displayed to the user. And finally, we are clearing all of the entries that user created during this session. We no longer need them. They've been saved in the CSV and uploaded to the SharePoint. To save your CSV file, you will need to create a new instant cloud flow. Choose the following trigger. When PowerApps calls a flow v2, PowerApps, and then name your flow. This is a very simple flow. The input parameter is our comma delimited string. We then create an action that generates the CSV file name. We are using the dynamic content to accomplish that. We then create an action that generates the CSV file. The file will be created in the SharePoint library IRM HR data connector files that we created in the beginning of this tutorial. Next action is respond to a PowerApp or flow, and it will return the name of the file that we just created back to the Canvas app. Now our file is created and we need to automate uploading it to M365. Microsoft offers a Power Automate flow to accomplish this task. This flow is triggered when a file is created and uploads the CSV file that was added to the library to Microsoft Purview. You can download the zip file from the GitHub. I'm going to leave the link in the description below. Microsoft has an excellent article explaining how to use this flow, and because of that, I'm not going to go over the Power Automate flow and explain how to use it. However, I'm going to explain the modifications that I made to the flow so that it works with the solution that I created. The original flow is designed to work with OneDrive. I use a SharePoint library instead, so if you decide to follow my steps in creating a similar solution, here is what you would need to modify the flow. Delete the trigger that was monitoring OneDrive and then add the trigger for SharePoint when a file is created properties only. Add SharePoint site and the library that we created to hold the CSV files. Note that at the time of making this video, Microsoft had an error in the flow, and you need to be mindful if it's still there by the time you download the zip file. The CSV files that accumulate in the SharePoint library could be either a liability or an asset providing historical information. That depends on how your client views it. Should you decide to get rid of the obsolete files, you can add a delete file action to the flow after it uploads the CSV file to MS Purview. That's it, folks. If you found this video helpful, please like it and consider subscribing to receive notification for the future videos.